And it is my pleasure to introduce Ahuva Batya Scharff, who is a PhD and an award-winning author, founder, and principal investigator of the Institute for Complementary and Indigenous Mental Health Research, recipient of the Saul Feinstone Humanitarian Award, honoring her service to and advocacy for those suffering from mental illness, trauma, and addiction. She travels the world, speaking, teaching, and advocating for compassionate practices that destigmatize and address the psychological impacts of climate change. Dr. Scharff's research on trauma led her to an interest in trauma related to climate change, and her latest release, The Path to God's Promise, combines Jewish perspectives on social action with climate science. And it is my privilege to turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Faye, and it's delightful to be here. I'm so grateful that you're all here with me this afternoon. And if you have questions throughout, please raise your hand or just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. I do like to address questions as they arise. And I do have some slides to share with you. And so we're going to start from the beginning. And I have several topics that I want to discuss in this session, and they are the climate change situation, which I'm sure you've been hearing about for the past few days, so we'll go over very briefly. The idea of free will and what we can do to address the issue. What are we willing to give up as Jews and as individuals in order to address climate change impacts, the evolution of Jewish practice that would be necessary to truly address climate issues and community connections. So what is the situation? Well, there's some really strong data that has been gathered from climate scientists around the world. The Earth's temperature has been rising since the pre-industrial era and has been picking up rapidly. 2023, last year, was the warmest year on record by far, hands down. Overall, we have seen about a 2.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature from last year and going back to around 1850. But the last few years have been by far, again, the warmest on record. And we are already seeing, Myron, I'll get to you in just a second, the effects of climate change in the loss of sea ice, melting glaciers, sea rise, rising sea levels, heat waves, fires, so on and so forth. Myron, you had a question.
We don't have to give up anything. I have on good authority that if the world pursues solving climate change with our tools, we will earn over $10 trillion a year.
Okay, Myron, let me hold before you make a speech. Let's hold that. Let me make the case, and let's see what I'm going to ask you to give up before you make a presentation about how much money we're going to make if we address climate issues. So hold that thought. And the magnitude of climate change is quite frightening in the scientific community. We are seeing projections that on the low end are absolutely something we can deal with, and on the high end would mean the end of our species. So we don't know. We do not have definitive data on where in that range we are going to fall, but the scientific community is strongly suggesting mitigation and adaptation techniques. So a little bit more data is that we are at a tipping point. We are there. We have already crossed some thresholds from which we're not going to return, but we are still not at the place where we cannot mitigate some of the very worst aspects of climate change. What scientists are concerned about are the collapse of the major ice sheet and the loss of glaciation, the loss of glaciers around the world. I used to live in Kenya when I was an undergraduate, and the snows of Kilimanjaro was where we went, and it was so beautiful and blah blah blah. The glaciers on Kilimanjaro are almost gone. We could see an end of that in the next few years to few decades. So we're losing this land ice glaciers at an alarming rate. And we are seeing in the United States and in Canada examples of impacts of climate change. I live right on the border, right at the border to Vancouver, Canada, 100 miles north of Seattle. And we get smoke from intense wildfires every year coming from Canada. We see wildfires all across the United States, particularly in the Western United States. We're seeing loss of freshwater resources. We're seeing loss of fishing resources. There was not last year, but the year before, a complete ban on fishing one particular type of crab in Alaska because they can't find them anymore, and scientists believe they may be extinct. So we don't know if this particular species of crab has moved to colder waters and we just have not found them, or if they have gone extinct. But complete ban on fishing that type of crab. So we're seeing this type of situation, these types of situations emerging. What does this mean for human beings? Well, we're likely to see a sea rise level of anywhere from 1 to 6 feet by the end of the century. We think that's probably on the low side, but just to give you some ideas, New York City sits at 33 feet. Miami, 6.5 feet. Seattle will be okay. We're at 174 feet, but London's at 36 feet. And Tel Aviv is at 16. So just even on the low end of sea rise, we see water inundation into many of our major cities globally. Hurricanes become stronger. We're definitely seeing this in the United States. One of the things that we're talking about out here is insurance. What are the impacts on insurance? Because there are places that have had so many hurricanes that are so devastating, insurance will not cover that anymore. So do you rebuild? How do you rebuild? What does that mean for communities? More droughts and heat waves. When we have droughts, especially here in the Western United States, we talk about the difficulty of water resources. Do they go to urban areas? Do they go to farmland? That is a particular interest in California, where water resources on the Colorado River are desired and needed by urban areas, but farmland wants and needs them just as much. We also have issues of electricity. When it gets hotter, more people want to run air conditioning. How do we deal with that? We have a longer and more intense wildfire season. Again, we're starting to see out here in the West, insurance will not rebuild those homes. We have changing precipitation patterns, which has issues for agriculture. Does rain come when you need it, where you need it, and in the amounts that you need it in? Do we have flooding? A lot of rain, that precipitation that we're seeing comes heavier and more intensely, which creates flash floods. We also have new lakes. There's a huge lake that was formed in Pakistan. There was a huge lake that was formed in South Sudan because of climate change. Do we have dam failures? What do we do about fishing? All of these are related to changing precipitation patterns. We will now have frost-free seasons, which extends the growing season, good news, but harvest viability depends on water. So is it coming where and when and in the amounts that we want? Is it too hot at some times to grow plants? I was in Texas during a drought. I put corn in and it grew and grew and it was lovely, and then it burned right down because the sun was just too intense. The stalks burned right down to the ground. We also have to consider pest control. We need freezes to control many pests. And so do we have pest control issues, not only for agriculture, but also for human beings, because if it gets cold and you kill off mosquitoes, for example, you can see a decrease in some diseases that are transmitted by biting insects. Global temperatures will continue to rise, and we have to think about livability. Sea temperatures, soil temperatures, because what can live when it's too hot or too cold in the sea or in the ground? What is also particularly concerning is that the Arctic is very likely to become ice-free. And what does that mean? At least seasonally ice-free. What does that mean for us? We don't really have a good grasp scientifically. We don't have a good grasp on what those impacts would be. So why did that's, sort of a basic idea of what was happening and why I decided to write a book about climate change. But I decided to write a book, The Path to God's Promise, and I wrote it as climate fiction. And I wrote the book for several reasons. First of all, trauma. I have been involved in addiction treatment and trauma research for the last 20 years. I'm the founder of a research institute. And as part of my work, I go around the world working with various groups and populations. And I have been seeing more impact of climate change on a variety of communities. I've been seeing that particularly in marginalized communities. I've been seeing it particularly in non-Western communities, and I've been seeing a significant amount of trauma, individual and community trauma related to climate change, which is what got me interested in the field. I'm also interested in marginalization. So in the last 30 years on these expeditions and research tours, looking at mental health in non-Western primarily situations, I've seen how people who are not causing climate change are the first to suffer the impacts. And that, of course, got me interested in it. I also, Jewish, right? So I'm interested in what is the Jewish response to these activities. I also, the first trip I took to Israel, I don't know, about a dozen years ago or so, I got to go to the Arava and I got to go to kibbutzim and moshavim research institutes that are involved in dry ASAL, arid and semi-arid land research into agriculture. And my training initially was in international development, looking at grassroots development projects. And I got to see drip irrigation in Kenya and what that means. And of course, it comes from Israel. And so I was interested in why Jews care about the environment, because it seems we may care about the environment disproportionately to other groups. We may have a little bit more interest in that. Why is that? And I'm also very interested in the research that's coming out of Israel. I also kind of feel like Jews have a moral obligation to act. That's sort of, I mean, I could go into all the, different Talmud and so forth, but let's just say I feel like we have a moral obligation to act. But I did choose fiction. And I want to be super clear. While my book is grounded in science, I chose fiction. And I chose fiction because of the pushback against scientists, the anti-intellectualism that I've seen globally around this. And I also wanted to create a protagonist, a character in Elinor, in the main character of my book, who would perhaps be more relatable than I am, right? She's just a sort of average, not very special, not hyper educated, not necessarily well traveled, not, special, except that God speaks to her, right? She's a prophet in the book. But I wanted to make a character that was relatable to say, so that people could say, hey, I could do this too. So that's where this topic comes from and why I wrote the book that I wrote. So one of the things that I talk about a great deal in the book is free will. And in Torah, in Tanakh, in Talmud, in Midrash, in, so on and so forth, Zohar, Kabbalah, Musar. Action is not compulsory. We have the option of doing whatever we please. And that is critical to Jewish thinking. When you think about the Greeks, right, there's so much destiny, and the gods come in and manipulate all the things, and people don't have a lot of choices, if any at all. But in Jewish thought, action is not compulsory. And so I wanted to look at this. And again, I wrote Elinor, and I wrote her as a prophet, literally someone who has actual conversations with God, because I wanted to be able to ask these questions out loud. One of the issues that I wanted to address is we have the authority to act. One of the things I love about Torah, about the first, 5 books, is that there are all these really problematic, flawed, difficult people who take their issues directly to God, talk directly to God. There's no intermediary, and bargain. There's all sorts of stories in Torah where we're bargaining with God, right? And so Moses does it, Abraham does it. There's all these times. And so I wanted to look at this idea of, do we have authority, and underscore the fact that we do. I gave Elinor a troubled past. I made her someone who struggled with addiction and is in recovery from addiction and in recovery from trauma, because I wanted to note that we all have power to act. You don't have to be special to make a difference. And I made her a secular woman who loves her people, because I wanted to underscore that we have a personal and community interest in acting, that this is something that we have to do in order to have the communities that we want. I also look at the idea that we are aspects of divinity, both in Jewish tradition and in consciousness studies. There is this idea that God is experiencing God's self through us. So there was Simsum, that God is nothing, no thing. God wants to have some sort of other experience. I don't know, that's just the best way I can put it into language. Contracts, explodes, there's the Big Bang, right? And then all of this comes into being. God is everything or nothing, all things or no things. And so we are an aspect of that. Now, consciousness studies says that we are literally made of stardust, and that we are all energy, and that this is illusion. The Hindus talk about it very interestingly as Brahma, one of their deities, is dreaming the universe. That's not exactly where Jews take it, but it's a similar idea that we are an aspect of the divine, which to me underscores that idea that we must act. That if I am, and I underscore if, this is a thought experiment, but if I am an aspect of God, experiencing God's self, do I not then have an obligation to give this, God, whatever that is, right, of my non-understanding, the best experience it can have, so that I can have the best life that I can have? I mean, it's both selfish and, a loving gesture of a nod towards the divine. Of course, in Lurianic Kabbalah, there's the idea of kelipot, that there is light that is in these husks of darkness, and that we have the opportunity, rather than responsibility, the opportunity to bring more light, to unhusk this light that is shrouded in darkness and bring that light to the world. And one of the things that I like about this concept is that it asks us not only to do that externally, but also internally, that we look at what are the dark places, what are the difficult places that we have internally, and to try to improve those, bring that light in. Finally, I looked at the obligation to act on behalf of the climate beyond tikkun olam as good deeds. There are so many places in modern Jewish action where tikkun olam is just a series of good deeds, right? We get coats for the homeless people when it's cold, and we I don't know, bring food to the food bank. We at my shul they gather food for the food bank on Yom Kippur, which I think is the strangest thing ever, but that's what they do. But tikkun olam is not good deeds. That's not what I mean, that's nice, and please, I think it's good that we bring food to the hungry and coats to the cold, but we need real reform. Genuine repair of the world is social reform. And so, I think back to Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with MLK, right? And really trying to change the world that we live in. And I think that's something that climate change and the climate crisis gives us an opportunity to do. So this is where Israel, the people, has an opportunity to be, quote unquote, a light to the nations. And if so, how do we do that? So that's what I was thinking about in terms of free will and the climate crisis as an opportunity for beautiful, really global action that Jews can take part in. So, as Myron said, maybe we don't have to give up anything. I asked the question, what are we willing to give up? So how do we take meaning, into action? One is, I think a lot of us, not necessarily everybody, because there are some people who are incapable of doing this, and they get a free ride, right? We don't leave anyone behind. That's a very basic Jewish tenet. But the way we get our food, we cannot all rely on the convenience of grocery, because it means that we bring in foods from all over the world, expect them at very low prices, and the shipping, right? We've seen this in the Middle East. When you mess up a shipping line, we have problems. So personal and community gardens, first we have to look at sustainable food production at community garden spaces. Now, some of you probably live in cities. You say, well, where can I grow food? But during World War II, my grandfather wrote the articles about victory gardens they were syndicated in the newspapers all across the United States. And he taught people how to grow in pots, how to grow indoors. Now there's hydroponics. You can grow enough for one or two people, fresh vegetables in a tower in your apartment in New York City, right? You can grow all sorts of ways. We used to have community garden spaces. We don't necessarily have those anymore, where people can get together and grow. There is gleaning. I have a number of fruit trees in my gardens. I am a single person who lives alone. I can't possibly eat the amount of fruit that the trees produce. In all of my gardens, I have done this. And so I have people come, I preserve, I dry, whatever it is I'm going to do that year. And then that's like a bowl, right? I mean, how much does a single person need? That's a bowl. And so then the people from the food bank come and they take all the rest of it. Poultry. If you want protein, whether that's eggs or other animals, are you willing to raise your own poultry? This is what I'm talking about. Giving up convenience. Some people can't do it. Some people can. And beekeeping. Just going to leave that there. We will have to radically alter urban areas. Major cities like New York City, like Los Angeles, they are not viable long term without changes. We're seeing this already happening in Europe, making places walkable and bikeable, having green spaces, taking out roads for cars and instead putting in green spaces. It drops the temperature, it holds moisture in the ground better, and brings opportunities for growing food. We also have rooftop gardens. We may have to give up some of our conveniences like delivery. And this is the hardest one for me because I live in the country and Amazon is so easy and it gets it here so fast, so cheap. But it is not sustainable that if I want, I don't know, a little thing, that Amazon is going to put it in a box and drive it up here, at least from Seattle, 100 miles, within 48 hours. It's just not sustainable. I have to give up some of that convenience. We have to look at refuse reduction. Switzerland's been doing an amazing experiment with this, that they don't use the same kinds of packaging that we do. It's not clamshells and you know, I get this living lettuce and they bring it to me in a clamshell of plastic. Are you kidding me? I put it in a bowl and it lasts me 2 months living on my kitchen counter. Those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to give up. We have to look at how we bring our produce and other items to us and so on and so forth. What are our relationships? We have to look at the relationship of land use and housing. So I live in the northernmost county here in Whatcom County in Washington. And when land is taken for affordable housing, we have a very unaffordable housing market here. I think the median price is around, I don't know, $600,000, $700,000, something like that. The only land that's available is farmland. So when we push affordable housing, quote unquote, into what would be the suburbs, right, and create suburbs, we are taking away farmland. So there has to be some sort of discussion about what does housing look like, how much farmland do we need, and what are the relationships there. In terms of Judaism, we have to look at our insularity and our interactions in interfaith situations. So Jews aren't really supposed to, according to Talmud, interact with other people unless we really have to, right? And there was a wonderful, I was studying Talmud, and there's a wonderful section about shoelaces. And if the Romans are wearing a certain kind of shoelaces, right, the Jews can't wear those kinds of shoelaces because Jews wear Jewish shoelaces and not Roman shoelaces. But there was some guy that they wanted to be a spy. And so he was given a dispensation to wear the Roman shoelaces because it wasn't for, you know, fashion. It was for the good of Israel. Okay, so I'm like, oh, all right. Does that level of insularity serve us? Now, we don't see that across Jewish traditions for the most part, but we do have groups who engage in that level of insularity still. I was in Israel, and my friend, she wanted to take me to some bookstore in a very ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. And, you know, I'm in a skirt to my ankles and, you know, covering, I think it was hot, so I might have only been covering my elbows and not all the way to my wrists, right? But I'm dressed very respectfully and appropriately, but I don't wear a wig. I don't wear a wig because I'm not married, have never been married, and so it's not required. The stink eye that I got for not wearing a wig, right? Because of the assumptions that were made, or the, you know, why at, you know, my advanced age, am I not married? All of those things. And so we have to look at our insularity. The other place where we run into problems with relationships in terms of climate change is in interfaith activities. And I see a lot of interfaith activities as being conciliatory and appeasing. We're like the dogs who want to just belong. Okay, well, the Jews want to be with the, you know, with the coat drive too, and we'll bring a lot of coats, and we'll do the food drive too. But I'll tell you, when October 7th happened, right, we've seen it all over the nation, those groups were not supportive of us because of these perceived wrongs. So where are we going to make these differences? We will have to look at business regulation. What can businesses do? How can they pollute? How are they regulated, and so on and so forth? So it's something to consider. We also would have to work with other groups with regard to water and air. Water, at least in the Western United States, there are treaties where Native American groups, in addition to government agencies, have significant rights with regard to water and have say. So here in Washington State, for example, salmon fisheries are controlled by the tribes. So they have done some people say terrible things, some people say wonderful things, but they have made the tribes have made some decisions about fishing and water use in this state. And those are people who are going to have to be allies, whatever it is that the group consensus is to do going forward. Collectives work really well for Jews. Kibbutzim, moshavim, if you see them in Israel. I was so touched. A friend of mine is a leader on a moshav in southern Israel. And after October 7th, when the ties fled, and God bless them, I would too, people from all over the world flooded in and pulled and harvested the crops. That is the power of the collective. That's the power of the collective. And I think that that is a strong suit that Jews in North America don't necessarily use so much, but has tremendous opportunity in other places. We can also use collectives in synagogues and other locales. My synagogue, we're rural, so we have a huge, huge plot of land, and we have no garden. And I think it's kind of sad. We just have this huge plot of land that nobody uses for anything. And I think that there are opportunities, whether that's for the Jewish community or for the larger community or whatever. I think that we have opportunities for collective action within our synagogues and also our locales. Intersectionality is, to me, quite difficult. You know, how do we get along with people who at present may be demonizing us? You know, somebody said something to me about the war, and I said, you know, Bibi does not call me. Like, Bibi does not ask my opinion, right? And so how do we, because we have to be the walking and chewing gum people. Like, we can't only be focused on the war. The war is terrible, and to the rise of anti-Semitism, you know, or letting it out of the bag again is terrible. There are all these terrible things that are happening, but that doesn't mean we can't stop our other work. And so how do we work with other people and other groups? What are our priorities? That's something that we have to come to terms with, because we can't do anything meaningful without other groups buying in. And so there's also the issue of relocation. Some of us Jews may be relocating because of political situations where we are. I know Jews who have left London. I know Jews who have left the United States. And do they go to Israel? Do they go somewhere else? I was just in Ecuador, and I was invited to come there. You know, are we going to have to go places? And if it's not Israel, then where is it? And how do we make a positive contribution wherever that is? And then on the flip side, there are refugees flooding into other nations. The United States is one of them, flooding into other nations. How do we address their needs and so forth? So is there a need for an evolution of Jewish practice? And I suggest that we may need to reimagine some aspects of Judaism. And one is, we could consider returning to a Judaism that has much more feel for Judaism as an earth-based practice. Renewal, I think, does a very good job of this, that we can see where there are traditions in Judaism that are definitely agricultural and seasonal, but we have to look beyond Sukkot and Tu B'Shvat and look at the seasonality of Judaism, because so many Jews now live in urban areas. I don't think there is the appreciation for the context from which this comes. Like I was like seven species. I can only remember 6 of. I was forgetting olives, but because you can't grow olives where I live, it's too cold. So to really ground ourselves in the traditions that are there in Judaism that are getting glossed over for other things. I love Honi the Circle Maker. Honi, I always am Honi for Purim, although I could be Moses or Dumbledore or, any number of other people too. But I love Honi the Circle Maker because Honi is about water. Honi is about agriculture. Honi is about feeding people. But what's interesting in Honi's story is that Honi is ridiculed because he, quote unquote, doesn't talk to God in the right way. And I think that we can learn a lot from that, because here you have someone who's really trying to help the community by bringing rain, and the community doesn't like the way he does it. And I think that's something that we have to look at, and it's something that I address in the book. Like, how can we be the best Jews that we can be? I also think that egalitarianism has to be practiced across all forms of Judaism. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but it's why I made Elinor a woman. There are female prophets, women as prophets, all throughout Torah, but their stories are pushed to the side. And I also think that this may be a turning point for us, because generally through our history, it's the zealots. It's the most, I think of the Maccabees, right? That's our path. It's not the people who went to diaspora and assimilated and now are gone, but it's the people who hold on to the traditions. So it's not about letting go of traditions, and it's not about being different than who we are, but it's about using our traditions in ways that promote the ongoing life of our planet and our species in a way that is pleasant for human beings. So can we have a Judaism, and this is what the book asks us, that is neither insular nor appeasing? And what does inclusion look like? And we have all sorts of issues with that, right? So if someone has a non-Jewish spouse, can they be married by a rabbi? Can they be included in the membership of the congregation? Reform says if your father is Jewish, you're in, and the rest of, Judaism says, well, maybe we should not change that. So these are discussions that have to be had and really decided upon, and we don't have a way of doing that now that Talmud is those discussions are ended. Beyond the diaspora, I think we can learn from Israel, because Israel takes everyone and they just figure it out. They don't necessarily like each other. They don't necessarily conform to the same ideals. But they figure it out. And there was a wonderful book by Saynor and Singer, The Genius of Israel, that came out, I want to say like the 13th or the 21st, something like that, of October. So right after, about 2 weeks after the war started. And but it talked about how Israel is able to assimilate and bring together people so that they become Israeli, even when they're different. Now, it might take a generation, right? Because when the people just come in, we bring with us, right? I'm an American. Everywhere I go, I'm an American. I'm a Jew first, but everywhere I go, I'm an American. So how do we learn from Israel? We can build connection through our interactions, and we can do this by overcoming the ugliness of factionalism that is both ethnic, right? Ashkenaz doesn't get along with Sephardi, doesn't get along with Ethiopians, they don't do it right, blah, blah. And denominational, which I find shocking, right? Because at the end of the day, we all get put on the same train car. And so it doesn't matter to me. Pesach's coming. Pesach's my favorite holiday. Love Pesach. Pesach's coming. You know what? I don't go through my house with a feather. And if you don't want to eat at my house because I don't go through it with a feather to take the chametz, okay. But I appreciate that I'm not demonized for that, right? Because I'm not going to put tinfoil all over my kitchen, and my dog who has a bad tummy gets the same food, which is not kosher for Passover. I don't care, because to me, that's not what being Jewish is about. But if that's what you do, and that's, I think, where we have to get to, is letting people be the kind of Jews that they want to be without, because that's the only way we push our whole agenda forward. And I think Israel can teach us something about this embracing of diversity. So what can you do to help? Understanding the issues, knowledge is key. Changing your lifestyle, looking at where do you get your food. I started getting a food box of food that is not suitable for grocery stores, right? It's odd shaped, it's not big enough, it's too big, it's, got a mark on the side, whatever, but it's perfectly good and usable food, right? So I started to do that. Where can we make changes? And can we learn new skills, which I'll talk about more in a second? Volunteer and participate. Begin with the basics: food, water, health, shelter. And where can your skills be put to good use? So for me, I've always been interested in mental health. I started in addiction and trauma treatment. And then as I traveled speaking all over the world at different conferences, I started seeing climate-related trauma, and I moved into that field. Why? Because I have something to offer. Because I've been all around the world, worked with all sorts of groups, seen many, many different types of trauma treatments. And one of the things that I've learned is it isn't the trauma that most often needs to be treated. In Pakistan, more than 10 million people were displaced by a flood that made a huge lake in the middle of the country. They don't need trauma treatment first and foremost. They need a way to feed their children, right? If you can feed your children, then a lot of the trauma symptoms go away. We have a much smaller pool that needs to be addressed. So where can we put our knowledge? I don't get paid for any of this. It's a way that I can be of service because people have been of service to me, right? Volunteer and participate. And then look at these issues outside of our neighborhoods, looking at how do we grow, not only as individuals, but as communities. And I think this is where new skills are so important. Can you sew? Can you knit? Are you a master gardener? Do you know how to tan leather? Do you know how to preserve food? These are all different things that we can bring to the table. We can learn these skills and we can teach them. And these are the best ways to build relationships, not only to address climate change, but to address all social issues. I was living in Kenya. I was in college, and I grew up on a farm, and there was a female sheep that was having difficulty birthing in birthing. And so I walked out with the herder and I said, "Oh, let me help," because I grew up with sheep. I knew what to do. They'd never seen a Jew before. They didn't know what a Jew was, but all of a sudden they're pretty interested in who this Jewish lady was who could birth a sheep. Why? Because that's man's work. And they certainly didn't expect a fat white, to them I'm white, fat white, and we don't even know what a Jew is, person to be able to help. These are the ways that we build relationships. It's by being of service to one another without judgment. And finally, spreading the message that genuine social change is required to offset the worst impacts of climate change. We will not recycle our way out of this. We have to make changes that as individuals may not necessarily look that huge. I remember what my life was like before Amazon. It wasn't worse. It's just convenient now. I can certainly take grocery bags. I used to forget them at first, but after the first 6 months of having to pay for a bag, you remember, oh, they're in the back of the car. Take it into the store with you. Now it's habit. These are the things, so will we have to give up some conveniences? Sure. But I am not so important that this much inconvenience, this much imperfection of my fruits or vegetables, this much being careful with my lettuce instead of it coming in a clamshell is really harmful. And I think the benefits that we see when you walk through these cities in Europe that are making these changes to go greener, to have green spaces, to have community gardens, to get older people and younger people working together to feed people in need, the benefits far outweigh anything we give up. So I'm going to ask, did we cover these topics? A little bit on the data of what climate change is happening, that we do have free will, and I see it as an opportunity to make changes. What are the things we might have to give up? Some of our insularity, some of our prejudices, some of our conveniences or perceived conveniences. And if we give those up, what do we get in return? Is there a need for an evolution of Jewish practice? I argue in my book that there is, and that there is ample. We don't have to change, but just re-emphasize where we come from. And we come from desert farmers and herders. And just like Israel is doing, we can bring life to the desert again. Israel used to look like Greece, and it can once more. And how do we make community connections? And I think we do that. We start at home, and with more tolerance for fellow Jews, and also looking at strategic relationships with other communities. These are my books. Here is my contact information. I have references for all the things. If you're interested, please let me know. All right. Myron, we'll go back to you. Do you have, did I sufficiently answer your question?
Well, I don't think that I did not really want to derail your thread. I think it was really powerful what you were saying. I was saying something, I don't think subtly different. I think it was substantially different. And the question isn't whether or not those myriad of problems that we have shouldn't be solved in a cohesive way and also in a Jewish way. But if the goal is to stop climate change, to stop the 2 or 3 degree rise in temperature and slow down and reverse the ice problem and sea level rise and so forth, which obviously from your perspective are just aspects of the problem. But for me, that's the problem. If that is the problem, the question is, how do you solve it? And I don't think you can solve it with an ethical or a social approach. I think you have to pay people to do it. I am very much a Jewish environmentalist and environmental Jew, and I care a lot about the theology and philosophy and ethic of being Jewish, and it's real important to me, and I want to incorporate those things into my life. But I'm not going to get 20% of the people in New Orleans or Louisiana or United States or the world to follow those steps. And we need 80 to 90% of those people to be in line with solving the climate problem, or it isn't going to get solved. So the problem
So Myron, the scientists are going to disagree with you to the extent of that you need to get the people on board. If we're only looking at water at sea level, okay, and I think there's much more to it, but let's just take your issue. If we are only looking at sea level, that is not a community issue. Like I said, we are not going to recycle our way out of it. You don't have to get 80-90%. That is governmental regulation. You're right. Somebody has to get paid to do that. Governmental regulations. Business has to look different. Communities have to look different. I see them as apples and oranges. What I'm saying is that climate change. So I think you're correct in that. You're not going to get people in New Orleans to do that. And frankly, it wouldn't matter if you did. Those are things that we have to look at globally.
Correct. And that's the reason I say it is, I think if you look where the biggest parts of the climate problem are, which are in energy, and like the first 2/3 of the climate problem is energy, and then agriculture and things like that. And then these other things that you talked about are very bad for our planet, but they're not causing climate change significantly. And if you want to get that 80% of the problem, or 60%, whatever the right number is, because I don't care if one number is the other. If you want to get that happening, you have to pay them to be good. You cannot get the government. There's no carbon tax that would work.
No, Myron, you're misunderstanding. And I see Faye is waving us off, but your misunderstanding is that I am looking at all aspects of how human beings will have to adapt. I'm talking about adaptations.
Mhm.
No, I'm not talking about the same thing that you're talking about. It's a different issue, Myron. Faye, you had a question.
We're really at the end of our time here, and I didn't want to lose the opportunity to thank you for your contribution to this festival and for everybody for coming today. So before we start losing people who are going off to various, I don't know, dinner making activities, depending on what time zone you're in, I just wanted to thank you for participating in this festival and the breadth of thought that we've heard over the last 2 days, and we have one more day.
Thank you so much for having me. And if any of you have questions, I'm happy to take them offline.
All right, I'll keep the room open for a few more minutes here.
I just want to say I really agree with what you said about those are real problems and we really need to solve them, and we need to put them into Judaism. And one of the things that really irked me to no end is that the last couple of sentences of Bereshit, where Joseph disowns all the Egyptians from their ancestral land, which caused no longer husbandry of the trees. We shouldn't have been surprised that 400 years later we had a plague in Egypt. And I asked the rabbi of my Chabad community if he would comment on it, and he could find nothing in the literature to support that assertion. It had nothing to say. And I was really devastated by that. It's not his fault. He's stuck in that milieu. We need a different way of being Jewish if we can't answer that question. Do you agree with me?
Well, I am a big fan of renewal, and Wilderness Torah Rabbi Golden invited me to Sukkot at because he said we do a rain dance, and I was like, I want to come because they're down in California, which is, it's like a 16-17 hour drive for me. It's far. Unfortunately, I'm just finished research. Actually, that's not true. I finish next week the research tour on my latest book on bravery, which is nonfiction. I usually write nonfiction. But I said this upcoming September, October, whenever Sukkot is this year, I am going to that because I grew up in the country. My family's from LA, but they wanted to be farmer. My parents wanted to be farmers, and so I've always lived in the country. And I see really strongly those those agricultural roots in our tradition, and that's what I'm drawn to. So yeah, I love it.
Hmm.
There's a Times of Israel article on Texans and cowboys from Montana who came to Israel to help out.
Yes. Yes.
So there's lots of friends out there in the agricultural communities.
Well, it's challenging because they're, evangelical Christians who have a very specific agenda. And on the one hand, it's very helpful that because they have skills.
They're farmers.
They're farmers. They have farming skills. And on the other hand, there's an agenda. And so it was a very good opportunity to show a richness of Judaism beyond what they are told. And I had a friend from Austin who went out and was at the Moshav and was picking tomatoes and but she's an educator in Austin who's like 60 years old. Like she's helpful to a certain point. I didn't go because I can't stand the heat. I can't do it. And so my friend, when I go to the Moshav, they're very sweet. They take me to see something and then they put me in some air-conditioned place. They're like, you can't do it.
Well, my husband's a retired accountant who did several days a week of volunteering for about 4 months out of Jerusalem. He went down with Leket on volunteering, and it turns out it's not so hot in the wintertime. So
no, in the wintertime.
It was not something I could physically do, but I'm almost a little jealous that he got to
my strength is animal husbandry.
There you go.
And so actually I grew up on a hog farm. So I'm very good with the pigs.
Hopefully
but
not.
I also grew up with sheep and horses and all the other things too. So well, thank you for having me.
We've come to the end of the hour, so
thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a wonderful Pesach.
You too.